The predator cubs of Bastion Reach were not raised with stories. They were raised with drills. Bastion Reach was a coalition military station carved from layered armor plating and suspended in orbit around a pale blue gas giant. Its corridors were narrow, reinforced, efficient. Its lighting was tuned for alertness, not comfort. And in one of its gravity-weighted training chambers, 4 predator cubs were being shaped into weapons. They were an extraterrestrial feline predator species, scaled instead of furred, their dark slate skin layered in subtle armored ridges. Their eyes glowed amber under low light, their claws curved and retractable, capable of puncturing alloy. Their teeth were narrow and serrated. They were young, but nothing about them was soft. Arkin was the largest of the 4, broad through the chest and already taller than most cubs his age. His tail moved like a counterweight when he fought, heavy and controlled. His default expression was intensity. Nisra was lean and sharp, her movements minimal and efficient. She never wasted motion. Her gaze tracked everything. Velk was analytical, slightly smaller but tightly coiled with precision. He studied patterns before acting. And then there was Soren. Soren was the youngest. His scales were a shade lighter than the others. His eyes lingered on details that didn't matter in combat. Their instructor, a massive scarred adult predator named Warmaster Dreeth, stood before them in the chamber. A jagged burn mark ran across his muzzle and down his throat. One horn tip was broken. In a voice like grinding stone, Warmaster Dreeth told them, "Strength is dominance. Hesitation is weakness. The galaxy respects only force." The cubs answered in unison, "Force ensures survival." They believed it. Until the night, they heard something that did not sound like war. It began as a faint vibration in the ventilation ducts while they were returning from endurance drills. The station lights flickered into maintenance blue instead of combat red. Soren stopped walking first. Arkin turned and demanded, "Why are you halting formation?" Soren tilted his head toward the wall and replied, "There is an irregular acoustic pattern beyond this plating." Nisra narrowed her eyes and listened. "It is not mechanical," she said quietly. Velk added, "It does not match alarm frequency or station diagnostics." The sound came again. Low, smooth, rising and bending in a way that felt curious. Arkin muttered, "Irrelevant," but he did not resume walking. The sound shifted again, playful, fluid, alive. Soren said softly, "It does not feel hostile." That was enough. Predators investigated anomalies. They followed the sound down an auxiliary corridor toward civilian quarters. It grew clearer as they approached a door labeled, "Olivia Garcia, Systems Engineering." The sound stopped. Arkin pressed the chime. The door slid open. Standing there was a human woman in her early 30s, medium height, warm brown skin, dark curly hair pulled into a messy tie at the back of her head. She wore a gray maintenance jumpsuit streaked with grease along one sleeve. In her hands, she held a curved brass instrument that reflected corridor light. She blinked at the 4 armored predator cubs filling her doorway. Then the human woman said carefully, "Unless the military has started recruiting very small dragons, I'm guessing you're not here for a routine inspection." The cubs stared at the brass object. Arkin asked in his deep, blunt voice, "Identify the device in your hands." The human woman shifted the instrument and replied, "This is a saxophone. It's a musical instrument." Velk stepped slightly forward and asked, "What is its tactical application?" The woman smiled faintly and answered, "No tactical application. It makes music." Nisra asked, "What is music used for?" The human woman rested her shoulder against the doorway and said, "Joy, expression, connection." The cubs did not respond immediately. Soren finally asked, in a quieter tone than the others, "Will you demonstrate?" The human hesitated, studying their armored forms. Then she stepped aside and said, "All right, but if you knock over my drum kit, I'm billing the coalition." They entered. Her quarters were cluttered but warm: tool racks, potted plants, and several instruments. A drum set, a tall upright bass, a keyboard along the wall. The human lifted the saxophone and said, "My name is Olivia Garcia. What you're about to hear is jazz. Jazz doesn't follow strict orders. You listen. Then you respond." She inhaled and began to play. The sound filled the small room completely. It flowed instead of marching. It bent instead of striking. When she finished, she lowered the instrument and asked, "Well, verdict?" Velk answered first. "The structure is unstable but internally consistent." Olivia laughed. "That might be the most technical compliment I've ever received." Arkin asked, "Can this be learned?" Olivia raised an eyebrow. "Everything can be learned. You'll just sound terrible first." That was how it began. Over the next several cycles, the 4 predator cubs returned during off-duty hours. Arkin chose the drums. The first time he struck them, the impact rattled the walls. Olivia winced and said, "Okay, big guy, less battlefield artillery, more rhythm." Arkin growled slightly and asked, "Define the difference." Olivia tapped the drum lightly and replied, "Rhythm is controlled power. It's knowing when not to hit." That unsettled him. Nisra chose the upright bass. She plucked carefully, testing tension in the strings. When a deep note vibrated through her scaled chest, Nisra admitted quietly, "The resonance is satisfying." Olivia grinned and said, "That's the groove." Velk approached the keyboard with analytical curiosity. After experimenting for a few minutes, Velk asked, "Why does this chord progression create anticipation?" Olivia answered, "Because tension makes the release feel earned." Soren stood before the saxophone. Olivia looked at his sharp teeth and said cautiously, "We're going to try this slowly." The first note Soren produced was shrill. Nisra flinched. Arkin's ears flattened. Soren lowered the instrument and said, "That was inefficient." Olivia laughed warmly and replied, "That was learning." The second note steadied. The third carried. Weeks passed. Their combat drills began to change. Arkin's strikes were no less powerful, but he began spacing them deliberately. Nisra anticipated Velk's feints without visual confirmation. Velk adjusted mid-movement faster than before. Soren moved in rhythm with them, rather than simply reacting. War Master Dreeth noticed. After a sparring session that looked more like choreography than combat, Dreeth summoned them. He stood before them, towering and scarred, and said, "Your timing has shifted." Arkin answered carefully, "Adaptation improves survivability." Dreeth narrowed his eyes and asked, "What is influencing your adaptation?" Silence. Then Soren spoke. Soren said, "We have been studying human music." The chamber went still. War Master Dreeth asked slowly, "Why would warriors waste cycles on civilian sound?" Nisra surprised even herself when she answered, "It requires listening." Velk added, "It enhances coordination under variable conditions." Dreeth studied them for a long moment. He did not forbid it. But tension coiled tighter. The true test came when Olivia proposed something reckless. A coalition unity assembly was scheduled, a gathering of multiple species to ease interspecies distrust. Olivia suggested they perform publicly. Arkin immediately objected. Public display risks reputational degradation. Olivia folded her arms and replied, "Or it shows control." Velk calculated aloud. Probability of disciplinary action exceeds 60%. Nisra asked, "What is the strategic gain?" Olivia looked at them and said, "Fear changes when it sees something unexpected." Soren said quietly, "If strength is control, this demonstrates control." They argued. Finally, Arkin made the decision. "We perform," he said. The night of the assembly, the central atrium filled with diplomats and officers. Olivia stepped onto the stage first and said into the mic, "My name is Olivia Garcia, systems engineer. Tonight, you're going to hear something different." She gestured behind her. 4 armored predator cubs stepped into the light. Murmurs rippled instantly. War Master Dreeth stepped forward from the security line and demanded, "Who authorized this demonstration?" Olivia answered clearly, "I requested 5 minutes." After tense consultation, 5 minutes were granted. Soren began. A soft sax note drifted into the atrium. Velk layered chords beneath it. Nisra entered with a low, steady bass line. Arkin waited, then struck the drums, not violently, but deliberately. The rhythm built. Soren bent notes with growing confidence. Velk shifted harmonies in response. Nisra adjusted tempo subtly. Arkin accelerated, and then pulled back at precisely the right moment. They listened. They adapted. They trusted. When the final note faded, silence hung for one heartbeat too long. Then applause erupted. Not polite. Genuine. Later, War Master Dreeth summoned them once more. He stood before them and said, "You diverted from standard training." Arkin replied, "Yes." Dreeth continued, "You did not lose cohesion." Velk added, "Coordination increased." Dreeth scarred muzzle tightened slightly. Then he said, "Combat requires timing." A pause. Then he finished, "You will continue standard training. You will also continue this exercise under supervision." It was not praise, but it was permission. Months later, Bastion Reach had a new tradition. Once per cycle, 4 predator cubs and 1 human technician played jazz in the atrium. They were still warriors, still trained for war, but they had learned something no combat manual contained. The most dangerous predator was not the one who only knew how to strike. It was the one who knew when not to. And that lesson began with a human named Olivia Garcia. And a sound that did not march. The change did not stay contained to the atrium. It spread. At first it was subtle. A human cargo supervisor began tapping her fingers along railings during maintenance checks, imitating Arkin's drum rhythm. An avian diplomat requested a recording of the scaled percussionist, as he called him. Even a pair of armored predator officers were overheard debating whether Nisra's bass timing had been intentionally syncopated or instinctive. But admiration always attracts resistance. 3 cycles after their first public performance, a formal complaint was filed. The complaint came from a senior coalition attaché who argued that predator juveniles performing civilian music blurred necessary military distinctions. The document described the display as cultural softening of a species whose strategic deterrence relies upon fear. War Master Dreeth received the notice in silence. The cubs were summoned. They stood in formation in the training chamber, claws retracted, tails still. Dreeth held the datapad in one scarred hand and said, in his graveled voice, "Your extracurricular activity is under review." Arkin answered evenly, "We remain combat capable." Dreeth's single clear eye locked on him. "This is not about capability, it is about perception." Velk asked carefully, "Is perception not a strategic variable?" Dreeth did not immediately respond. Nisra said, "Fear-based deterrence assumes static identity." Soren added quietly, "Jazz is not weakness." Dreeth's tail struck the floor once, not violently but sharply. He said, "The Council fears that exposure to human culture may dilute predator instinct." Arkin's jaw tightened. He asked, "Do you believe that, War Master?" There was a long silence. Finally Dreeth said, I believe instinct that cannot survive influence is fragile. That was the first time he had defended them. But scrutiny intensified. Their next scheduled performance was delayed pending review. Olivia learned about the complaint before the Cubs did. A fellow technician forwarded her the internal memo with a warning note attached. They're watching this closely. That evening, when the Cubs entered her quarters, she did not greet them with her usual humor. Instead, Olivia folded her arms and said, "You might be grounded." Arkin stiffened. "Clarify." Olivia explained the complaint in detail. Velk's eyes narrowed as he processed the political implications. Probability of cancellation. High, Olivia admitted. Nisra's claws flexed. Then we perform elsewhere. Olivia shook her head. This isn't about location, it's about symbolism. Soren asked quietly, "Are you afraid?" Olivia looked at him honestly and said, "Yes, but not of you." That answer settled something in the room. Arkin stepped toward the drum kit and said, "If they forbid public performance, we will continue privately." Velk added, "Skill degradation is not acceptable." Olivia exhaled slowly and said, "You four do realize you're fighting a political battle with a saxophone, right?" Soren lifted the instrument gently and replied, "Improvisation adapts." 2 days later, War Master Dreeth summoned them again. This time, the training chamber was not empty. 2 coalition officials stood at the far end, 1 avian, feathers silvered with age, and 1 reptilian diplomat with narrow eyes and polished scales. The avian official spoke first, his voice thin but firm. "We are assessing whether your activities compromise operational focus." Arkin answered with military crispness, "Operational metrics have improved." The reptilian diplomat tilted his head and asked, "Demonstrate." It was not a request for music. It was a request for combat. The Cubs were instructed to engage in a live tactical simulation. 4 against 6 adult trainees. The odds were intentional. The chamber lights shifted to combat red. Dreeth's voice echoed from the observation platform, "Begin." The adult trainees advanced aggressively, assuming brute force would overwhelm the Cubs. But something had changed. Arkin did not charge immediately. He waited. He watched Nisra's footwork, Velk's shoulder angle, Soren's tail flick. When the first adult lunged, Arkin struck not with raw fury, but on the offbeat of expectation. Nisra slipped between opponents, disrupting balance rather than overpowering. Velk redirected force with minimal contact, guiding attackers into each other's path. Soren moved like a melodic line weaving through percussion, unpredictable yet precise. They did not dominate through sheer violence. They controlled tempo. Within minutes, the 6 adults were pinned or disarmed. Silence filled the chamber. The avian official blinked slowly and said, "Their coordination is atypical." Velk answered calmly, "Adaptive synchronization increases survivability." The reptilian diplomat asked Dreeth, "Source of adaptation." Dreeth looked down at his Cubs and said, "Human jazz." There was a pause. Then, unexpectedly, the avian official began to laugh, a soft, whistling sound. He said, "So the predators learned to improvise." Dreeth replied, "They learned to listen." The review did not end there. A compromise was proposed. The Cubs would perform again, but this time as part of a formal coalition cultural exchange. The event would be recorded and analyzed. It was both opportunity and test. The atrium was fuller than before on the night of the sanctioned performance. Military observers stood alongside civilians. Recording drones hovered overhead. Olivia stood backstage with the Cubs. She looked at Arkin and said, "Nervous?" Arkin answered honestly, "Yes." Nisra added, "Pressure increases error probability." Olivia smiled gently. "Pressure also makes diamonds, or whatever space equivalent you have. Soren adjusted his grip on the saxophone and said quietly, "We do not have diamonds." Velk replied dryly, "We have compressed carbon matrices." Olivia laughed despite herself. Then she stepped onto the stage. She introduced herself clearly and explained that music was not the absence of discipline. It was discipline expressed differently. She introduced each cub, describing their training background, their physical presence, their role in the band. When she finished, she stepped back. This time, Arkin began. A steady, deliberate drum pattern, firm but restrained. Nisra entered with a bass line that rolled like distant thunder. Velk layered chords with calculated tension. Soren waited. The audience leaned forward unconsciously. Then Soren's saxophone cut through the air, not softly but boldly. The melody soared higher than before, weaving between structured rhythm and wild improvisation. Midway through the performance, something unexpected happened. One of the lighting rigs malfunctioned. A support cable snapped. The heavy fixture began to fall toward the crowd. Gasps erupted. Without hesitation, Arkin shifted tempo and shouted, "Left sector clear." Nisra dropped her bass and launched forward, claws digging into the falling structure to redirect its angle. Velk calculated trajectory mid-motion and shoved two nearby delegates out of impact range. Soren leapt from the stage, using the momentum of his movement to help Nisra brace the falling weight. The lighting rig slammed into the ground harmlessly, diverted from the audience. Security rushed forward. Silence hung over the atrium. Olivia stood frozen for one breath too long. Then she ran to them. She looked at the four scaled cubs holding the disabled structure in place and said, breathless, "Okay. That was definitely not part of the set list." Arkin released the rig and said calmly, "Improvisation." The crowd erupted, not in applause for music this time, but in stunned recognition. They had seen predators train for war. They had seen them choose protection. War Master Dreeth stepped forward into the center of the atrium. He looked at the gathered delegates and said in a voice that carried across the chamber, "Strength is not diminished by control." The avian official nodded slowly. The reptilian diplomat inclined his head. The narrative shifted that night. The cubs were no longer an experiment. They were proof. Proof that predator instinct and human influence did not cancel each other. They amplified. Later in Olivia's quarters, the five of them sat in exhausted silence. Olivia finally said, "You realize you just saved about 30 people." Nisra replied quietly, "It was statistically preferable." Velk added, "Casualty prevention increases coalition stability." Soren looked at the saxophone resting beside him and said softly, "We were listening." Arkin leaned back against the wall and admitted, "The rhythm warned us." Olivia watched them, these scaled warriors who had once asked what joy was for. She said gently, "You four are going to change things." Arkin looked at her and asked, "Is that good?" Olivia smiled. "Yes," she said, "that's very good." Outside, Bastion Reach rotated in silence around the gas giant. Inside, something fundamental had shifted. The galaxy had expected predators to roar. Instead, they played. And when the moment demanded it, they still struck. But only when it mattered.